Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this series of lectures and studies on a non-political view of the global political climate. What do we aim at with this series of lectures and studies? That is, to provide, on the basis of theosophy, non-political insights that can help you to determine the content of your vision and your attitude towards your fellow human beings and society. Universal brotherhood, according to Theosophy, is an important concept here. What is our individual responsibility in this regard? And that the highest in us, our inner wisdom, our inner leader, can always be our guide in this outer world. Summarized, how do we put our idealism into practice? The world political climate is currently fraught with tensions. This will certainly not have escaped your notice. In many countries, the relationship between political leaders and the people is under pressure. In the Netherlands, several citizens were unjustly victimized by government actions, such as, for instance, the treatment of victims of earthquakes in the province of Groningen due to decades of exploitation of gas fields. In several other countries, governance shows authoritarian traits, also in some European countries. What makes people make political choices? 2024 is an important year because half the world's population has gone to the polls. We felt this was reason enough to reflect on a universal, non-political view of the global political climate. The democratic legal form is currently the most common form of state in the world. Therefore, in this series of lectures, we want to reflect on the question, what does it mean for yourself as a spiritually evolving human being to live in a democracy and above all, to be that democracy together with all other people? And to take away any doubt, just a word in advance. The Theosophical Society never interferes in political matters. It is by definition above the parties and can therefore never support any party, because that would mean that it would then be working against another party. Every human being, every citizen has a certain responsibility in a democratic system. What that responsibility is what we are going to discuss in more detail today and in the next lecture. Because in our view, it implies at least that we can see voting as a duty, but in fact, it comprises much more. On the subject of voting and the ballot box, we will deliberately go into only at the end of this lecture, because first, of course, we are going to build up an extensive spiritual picture based on theosophy. The contents of the lecture consist of 3 parts. Part 1, a non-political vision and the theosophical basic principles. Part 2, how to recognize a wise leader. And part 3, what is the point of voting? So we start with part 1, a non-political vision and theosophical basic principles. What is political and non-political? Politics comes from the word politikos, from Greek, and means concerning the citizen. In the dictionary we find the set of political principles and rules according to which a state is or should be governed. But the present meaning is also often a little bit negative. Political behavior is cunning behavior. What is the meaning of non-political? In these lectures, we start from the spiritual background and the unity of life, in which the equality of human beings and harmony are key. And the idea of universal brotherhood is derived from the structure of the universe itself. As an introduction on the subject, first an interesting reflection from the media. Which democracies best guarantee democratic stability, security, and harmony? Recent research by the Chicago Center on Democracy, but previous studies show the same, shows that a high degree of economic inequality, that is a difference in income, increases the risk of a democracy slipping into an authoritarian form of governance. About 20 countries around the world are currently experiencing various forms of democratic erosion. Often presidents and prime ministers there increase their own power by attacking the press and judiciary, questioning officials and civil society groups, and undermining confidence in elections in case they lose them. To make this a bit more concrete, an example. Both the United States and Sweden are democracies where political shifts are taking place at the moment. In the United States, the economic inequality of citizens is quite high, and in Sweden, on the contrary, relatively small. The process of democratic erosion, or attempts at it, is much more recognizable in the United States than in Sweden, where apparently trust in public institutions still remains relatively high. Although democracy means rule of the people, in many democracies right now, there is a large group of people who are dissatisfied with politicians. In fact, the current political climate in democratic countries largely reflects that dissatisfaction. Many people experience it as if politicians have deprived them of something essential. But in many democracies, such as in the Netherlands, large parts of the population are even materially slightly better off than some 20 or 30 years ago. So where then does this dissatisfaction come from? That dissatisfaction may not have been entirely created, but at least strongly fueled by the political elite. Democracy, as understood by most people, involves going to the polls once in a while. After that, others take care of governance, and decisions are being made on the basis of a majority of votes. It is important to recognize the fact that today's mindset is mainly dominated by things such as desire and greed and the wish to have property, a strong drive for personal freedom, serving the interests of certain groups in society rather than the common good, and of course nationalism, glorifying one's own culture and putting it first, and fear of the unknown and the often rapid changes in the future. It is true that the world has been in a time of transition. In that respect, I want to refer to the coming lectures starting in January on the subject of 150 years of Theosophy. As a result of the present mindset, you get the following situation. Politicians try to entice voters to vote for them. Therefore, they promise all kinds of things which are often just not realistic. People do or do not vote and then don't really feel responsible for contributing to national governance. However, politicians' promises are often not kept, or people often perceive them to be so. Politicians are then called untrustworthy and are said to think only of party interests or themselves. For all the inconvenience and perceived injustice in society, the blame is then put on the administrators and politicians. They then twist themselves in all sorts of ways to keep the voters' favor. Their twisting is then perceived as hypocritical, and they are believed less and less. Moreover, we often see politicians polarizing, because to get one part of the people behind them, they oppose another part and thus divide society. In his book The State, Plato argues that democracy is the second worst form of state. Why? Because then the country is usually not ruled by people who rise above others in wisdom. The whole country is dominated by insatiable desires such as much personal freedom and material wealth as possible. For ignorance about the true nature of life has led to the misconception that economic prosperity and selfish pursuit of more wealth is roughly the same as happiness. In fact, we see these same selfish desires in politics itself, where party interests are often placed above the general national interest. It is opinions and not wisdom that quite often determine legislation. Plato therefore says that democracy is run by opinionated people, people who have little insight into the deeper background of things and rely only on selfish opinions, which often change. What seems true today turns out to be different tomorrow. What is an established fact for one person is an illusion for someone else. Such phenomena seem to have become more and more normal since political leaders in various countries oppose facts published by journalists, talking, for instance, about alternative facts. Because of the opinionated politicians, Plato says that democracy leads to chaos, which at some point becomes so strong that there is a call for a strong leader. And then democracy decays into an even worse form of state, tyranny. In the next lecture on January 5th, we will dwell in more detail on the different forms of state and how they emerge as described by Plato in his dialogues. Now you can also understand democracy in a different, more mature way. Namely, if the people rule, every citizen should feel himself responsible for running the country. As far as public administration is concerned, this does not mean that you go to the polls once every 4 years, but above all, that you feel yourself responsible in thought and deed for the ups and downs of the country you live in. This form of democracy was described at the time by President Kennedy of the United States and expressed as follows: ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. And if you want things to change, also remember Gandhi's expression, be the change you want to see in the world. There can only be justice in a nation if every citizen works for the common good. Leaders and co-workers both should know their duty, with one not being more important than the other. Plato described it as follows: every person in society should be given the means to develop his talents, and each person should then contribute his talents to society. So every person should be given the task for which he is naturally suited, and therefore those with greater insights should be given and should take the lead. More on that in the next lecture in January. What we want to highlight in these lectures is the idea that leadership belongs to everyone. We are all in positions somewhere in society where we have to lead, in our family, at work, or in our voluntary work. And keep in mind that in society, the wise leaders are not recognized as leaders at all, although they do function as such. These are the so-called informal leaders. Think of colleagues who everyone knows. If you are in a difficult situation, you can turn to them because they are looking for a solution based on wisdom. During these lectures, we will therefore give examples of leadership taking place in other contexts than just public administration, but also, for instance, in companies or voluntary organizations. In any form of state, but also in any organization, the question always arises how the wisest can be put in charge. In fact, it is of secondary importance how the wisest gets the lead, as long as he or she does get the lead. A democracy can do an excellent job of ensuring that the wisest indeed becomes the ruler, provided the people are able to actually elect the wisest. No wise leader can lead an unwilling people. A wise leader inspires, leads by example, gives advice, but he never forces. His authority, which he should have on the basis of his wisdom, can only be exercised if that authority is recognized and acknowledged by the people. So, the citizens of a country must therefore have developed some degree of wisdom within themselves. And all citizens must also have been empowered to understand why certain laws or measures are good to pass. Dialogue to create support, if possible based on consensus, is therefore essential. In a democracy, if there is a population that has developed some degree of civilization and understanding, then they will also elect their representatives who possess these characteristics in any case. If a nation sees itself as one of the many nations on earth, it will also have the universal leader which stands above the parties. Universality is indeed the most important characteristic of a wise leader. If the opposite is the case, citizens live in the feeling of separateness. Then they believe, for instance, that they are the best and superior people and that their country should be made great again, or that certain population groups are worth more than others, or who instead feel victimized by the elite. Then there are also issues such as racism, sexism, and uncivilized behavior. And even then, the leader will surface who has these characteristics to an even greater extent than the people. So, also in a democracy, the people get the leaders they deserve. We are now going to involve the knowledge of Theosophy to see what should be the basis for true wise leadership, which is non-political. Wise leaders assume a greater inner reality behind the material world, and experience they have gained with that greater reality, and put that experience to work for the benefit of their fellow human beings. If you want to describe that greater reality, a very fundamental and universal description of it can be found in Theosophy on the basis of the so-called three key ideas or the three propositions. The first key idea reflects that all life arises from an omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and immutable life principle. So we don't speak of a being. Because this life principle is boundless, it is everywhere and constitutes the deepest essence of every living being, be it a sun, a human, or an atom. For want of words, it also sometimes is referred to as the divine core of a being. It is good to realize that this life principle never manifests itself, yet all that is manifest comes from it. In the past, people in many cultures have tried to imagine this. One of these is the image of the so-called world tree. This is represented as growing from the top to the bottom, rooted in the principle of life, and its trunk, its many branches, its twigs and leaves extending in all directions downwards, and thus represented the manifesting and manifested life. And if you think this through properly, some of the consequences of that key thought are that everything in the universe is alive or is consciousness, that all beings have a boundless potential for growth in their consciousness. Just as the drop of an ocean holds everything of the ocean, so carries every human being within him everything of that boundless life. Another consequence is that there is a universal spiritual unity and inseparable connectedness of all life in the universe. What happens to one being affects all other beings. From that inseparable connectedness and the structure of the universe, as depicted with the metaphor of the world tree, flows the important idea that universal brotherhood is a fact in nature. The second key thought is cyclicity. In that boundless field of life, there is a ceaseless coming and going of beings. Just as in oceans, ebb and flow follow each other incessantly, so in human life, life and death follow each other constantly. For humans, we call this reincarnation. An important thought to keep in mind is that people reincarnate in groups as a result of their interconnectedness and thus cyclically build new cultures together in the course of history. And hopefully always learning lessons in the process, because, as the saying goes, he who does not know his history must redo it. The third principle of key thought is the fundamental equality of all beings and the continuous growth of all beings. Since we are all that boundless life principle, all beings are essentially equal to each other, but differ in degree of actual development. All beings are constantly developing more of their intrinsically boundless capabilities. This is called in Theosophy the principle of progressive evolution. And furthermore, and very important, all beings are equal, that is, equal in dignity and in rights. If we apply these thoughts to human society, we can link it to the thought that human solidarity in relation to the possibility of growth for everyone flows naturally from this. From those three key thoughts, some universal laws can be derived, including reincarnation, as just mentioned, or more generally formulated, re-embodiment. Karma is another universal law. The spiritual oneness of everything means that there is an inseparable interconnectedness of all life and thus of all human beings. At the same time, all beings are constantly changing. Nothing remains the same. This ensures that what one person does or fails to do always has consequences for the whole. And conversely, those consequences will in turn trigger a reaction from the environment. And since all life is essentially one, the sequences of actions and reactions are such that there is a law expressed in nature called the law of restoration of harmony, or the law of cause and effect, or also called karma. It follows from the first key thought, the first proposition, that everything is consciousness and that everything and everyone grows from within, from atom to galaxy. Everything learns to bring out its own latent, boundless ability, life after life, through interaction with other life. And in all this, there is a spiritual, hierarchical structure of consciousness. The more advanced consciousness inspires and exemplifies the less advanced consciousness. And this is what a true spiritual leader expresses through spiritual leadership. He or she will always and everywhere be a sun, using his or her influence to inspire everything and everyone. Spiritual leaders will naturally create an atmosphere to which less evolved beings are attracted, in which they can live, develop, and grow. And all this life naturally forms a hierarchical structure. Wherever we stand on the ladder of life, each being in that hierarchy is a channel through which life can flow. We are all seen in that light, a teacher and a student in relation to each other. Next to these three laws, There are 4 other laws, of which I will briefly mention the next 2. The 4th one is self-becoming. Every being is unique. You become who you are. That then makes us responsible for our own character. The 5th law is that of progressive evolution. We can evolve all latent capabilities if we want to. These 2 laws will be covered further in the next lecture. In the context of social improvement and wise leadership, in the early days of the Theosophical movement, Madame Blavatsky was asked how Theosophical principles should be applied so that social cooperation may be promoted and true efforts for social improvement can be carried on. Summing up, her answer was, in explaining that the Theosophical Society is non-political and focused on the improvement of humanity, that those principles are as follows. 1. Universal unity and causation or karma and the consequence of the connectedness of all beings. 2. Human solidarity regarding the opportunities of growth for each human being. And 3 and 4, the laws of reincarnation and karma. She called these the 4 links of the golden chain that should bind humanity into one family, one universal brotherhood. How to realize that? By actually applying true brotherhood in practice, where every human being lives for all other human beings. And we might add that that is especially likely to succeed in a true spiritual hierarchical structure. We will explore that further at the next lecture when we discuss a wise democracy. We will now take a break of 3 minutes for collecting your questions and see you soon after the break. Welcome back. Mariska, are there any questions?
I think the first part was very clear, Joop, but there's one question.
One question.
One question at the moment. When there are unwise leaders and there is tension between the loyalty to the rules of society and you could say the true value of life, is there then one way to act upon that according to theosophical laws?
So, if I understand the question correctly, there are unwise leaders
Yeah.
and there are tensions in the people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or in the person who is having to choose to follow the leader or to follow his heart, you could say.
Yeah. Well, a way to deal with this is, of course, not to be affected mentally by this, let's say, tensions that are there in the country, and to first of all to think about to guard your own thinking. So you should always consider what are the universal key thoughts that should be govern my own thoughts. And I mentioned these thoughts as the universal unity of all life and the connectedness of all life, human solidarity, so that everyone in the states still can continue to grow, and also take into consideration the laws of karma and reincarnation. And if you hold on to those key thoughts, then you will be able to distinguish which thoughts in society that give that result in those tensions and these, let's say, disharmony in society, you will be able to recognize what the causes of these thoughts are in society. And you will, if you understand that, if you recognize what these causes are, then you will, and you hold on to these key thoughts of theosophy, you will know that you will not follow, let's say, these thoughts that cause all this disharmony in society. And if you stay calm, inner calm, and you radiate this to your environment, then this will have a calming effect on the people around you. Uh, and they also might be inspired by you to start more thinking independently again about the real causes of the disharmony in the state. So you can contribute yourself by staying calm, by sticking to your own fundamental mentality, your own mindset based on these theosophical principles. And that can, of course, it can also evoke a reaction from people while you are not also following the thoughts that resulted in this disharmony, but you have to stay calm and respectful to everyone, but you have to stand your uh, to keep your position in this way, because if you are convinced about these theosophical principles, then people will not be able to convince you of their ideas.
Hmm.
If you have if are convinced of the truth of these theosophical key thoughts, then you can stay with it.
Thank you, Joop. And there's another question.
Yeah.
You talked about Plato and what he said that democracy wasn't the best form of state. Why is it so popular in nowadays, democracy?
Well, later on in the lecture in January, I will go in much more detail about how democracy can be seen. Uh, Literally, it means rule by the people. And of course, if you have rule by the people in the sense that everybody can do what he likes all the time, so with a lot of personal freedom, then Plato predicts that you get chaos, and in the end, the chaos will be stopped by choosing a strong leader, and then you end up in tyranny.
Mhm.
But also, we as humankind have started to learn that this way, this type of development of democracy is something we don't want. So we have started already 2 centuries back to think of mechanisms in the governance of states that prevents too easily that democracies slide down into tyrannies. So we have, for instance, and now I'm already explaining something I will tell in January more extensively, that we have found out the principle of the trias politica, which is the vision of the three independent powers in most democracy that we have now on our earth, and that is the the legislative power. So in our countries, it is the parliament who is in charge of uh, designing the laws of the country and issuing the legislation. You have the executive power, which is in fact the governance, the administrators of the country. So they run the country and they have to abide by the legislation. And then you have the judiciary part, that is the people who the courts who actually see after it that we abide by the legislation that we have legalized. And these three independent powers give a certain checks and balances in the governance of a country, so that it is not so easy to slide away, slip into tyranny. Although, as I said, also in some democratic countries, also in Europe, we see that there is a tendency towards sliding down towards authoritative regimes, and that is already a little bit a gray area between the good functioning democracy and a tyranny. And of course, there are also other forces, which I will explain later on, that also are risky for democracies, but the people in a country in fact determine which leaders they choose. So the mindset, the average mentality of the people of a country determine what type of leaders they choose, and whether this involves that they are sliding down towards autocratic rule, or whether they really maintain a democratic rule which can be influenced and determined by the voice of the people. So there are ways to stabilize democracy, and also to take care that the legislation that has been adopted is also that people abide by this legislation. And if that is not the case anymore, then you see slowly an erosion of the democracy, and it goes down towards autocratic rule.
Those were the questions for
Yeah,
now.
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your questions. And we now go to part 2, how to recognize a wise leader. Looking at society, the question quickly arises, are there any examples of that ideal leadership with a capital L? Leadership where the spiritual oneness of life is the basis. We know quite a few examples, although most of them from the past. For instance, the Buddhist king Ashoka of India, who was a great inspiration to his citizens. I will talk more about that in a moment. But also consider Plato's description of the state, where he clearly explains that the wisest man should lead the state. And one of the characteristics by which you can recognize the wisest is that he says, look for someone else, someone who is wiser than I am. The wisest should always be forced to take the position of the leader. If you hold this standard for a moment and consider how the leaders in our society got their position, hardly anyone meets this simple standard. Another great example is given by the philosopher Lao Tzu. He stated, a true leader walks behind his people and not in front of them, because in that way he can encourage and help his people to bring out the better qualities in them. The leader who walks in front gets in the way of his subjects because he limits them in their growth. These are a few key lines of thought which we will elaborate in this and the next lecture. From this moment on in the lecture, we completely let go of the negative characterizations about leadership that we encounter in society. And we will now elaborate some 12 characteristics by which we may recognize a wise leader who starts from the spiritual oneness of life and from spiritual brotherhood. And please also think about this yourself. You may come up with other important characteristics, and we may discuss these ideas of yours during our study meeting next week, Sunday. We will divide the characteristics of a wise leader using the aforementioned classification of the Theosophical basic principles as a basis. Universal unity and causation, the connectedness of all life, human solidarity and the growth of everyone, the laws of reincarnation and karma, and the hierarchical structure. What can we expect as features at universal unity and the connectedness of all life? First, the unity of all that exists is starting point for a wise leader. His policy always aims at the bigger picture. Separateness or exclusion in any form will be opposed. Inclusiveness is the key concept, as it is mentioned nowadays. He will extend this essential unity to all parts of his policy. He has no partial interests, such as party interests or interests of certain population groups. Moreover, he sees his country as part of the global community. He will therefore take into account the interests of other countries. A nice historic example is King Ashoka of India in the 3rd century BC. That period was marked by peace and a just society in the Indian subcontinent. Ashoka was actually more Buddhist than king. His actions were based on the idea of the spiritual oneness of all life. He taught his people through so-called edicts, a kind of wall posters, about the laws in the cosmos, the law with capital letters, the Dharma, and also the duty that everyone must fulfill if there is to be justice in the land. His success lay in the fact that he knew how to translate spiritual truth into practical situations. He founded the Dharma in laws, but above all in people's hearts. He appointed officials who did social work and intervened when they detected injustice. He cultivated friendships with other countries by establishing embassies there to prevent conflicts. He was a great example for the centuries to come. The second, truth, a starting point and aspiration. Even if the truth does not make him popular with the people, he will still never deny the truth. Illusions that he has seen through, he will expose and unveil as falsehoods. 3. Justice, a starting point. If we look at Plato again, he says that justice is a state of harmony which can only exist when everyone can take his place in society according to his talents. But when people are excluded, disharmony arises. Everywhere in the world where a certain layer of society is ignored or disadvantaged, a divide appears in society that always causes tension and disruption. This is often the result of governors who are not concerned with the whole, but mainly with the group interest or with their own interests. Then we will look at human solidarity and the growth of everyone. 4. Understanding human nature and giving confidence. The wise leader is not blind to the current mentality of people, but also knows that every human being is essentially a noble being. He will always develop his policy in such a way that people are enabled to develop their higher nature. An important condition is that he gives people confidence. Because what you want to stimulate in the other person, you have to radiate as an example yourself. If a leader is distrustful, he also arouses that distrust in the other person. If he radiates genuine confidence, he also inspires confidence. 5. Respecting and addressing people's free will. The wise leader will never want to change a country by force, but always by setting an example. Explain why certain measures are desirable and through inspiration. For a true leader will always appeal to inner willpower and never to outer desire. By focusing on that part of a man that realizes the oneness and connectedness with others, a leader will also stimulate those qualities, such as justice and a sense of responsibility. What we often see what populist politicians do is exactly the opposite. By promising all kinds of things that appeal to the selfish desire in us, they appeal to the very part of the human being that is self-centered and thinks it is separate from others. The aim to put our conscience asleep and push independent thinking to the background, and that they can therefore blame others for self-inflicted problems. It is also typical of populists that they always assume the role of victim, ignoring the inner faculties that every human being has, to the ability to improve conditions on your own. But populists are especially successful if the incumbent politicians lose sight of that unity, which creates discontent, which the populists then can cleverly use in their favor. 6. Finding causes and changing mindsets. A society can only rise in the level of civilization if the mentality of the people changes. Education and inspiration are therefore the cornerstones of the policy. Measures and laws that only affect people's behavior and not the mentality are therefore never sustainable. 7. Emphasize non-material values and growth opportunities for everyone. Attachment to material possessions can only lead to sorrow. The wise leader will therefore strongly advocate the non-material values of life. The mentality is to stimulate true religion, true philosophy, true science, and true art. But he will also never value one religion more than another. As an example, he will moderate his own material reward and that of other leaders. Plato also says that a true leader is someone who no longer desires anything for himself, but does everything to help the totality to advance. Leaders, he says, may not possess gold because they already have pure gold in their soul. A very nice example is José Mujica, the former president of Uruguay and famous for his modest way of living. Instead of living in the presidential palace, he lived in a simple farmhouse, and his Volkswagen Beetle was his presidential car. He was nicknamed the poorest president in the world because he gave away 90% of his income. And I understand that he also has refused his pension. He does not consider himself poor, but he likes to live modestly. His mission as president was to help the most vulnerable in Uruguay and to make the country a little less unjust. In some magazines, he was called, following Plato, the president philosopher. If you look at all the great world teachers, one of the similarity is that they always treat others as equals. Why? Because every person potentially has all the same qualities within him and is therefore, in principle, equal. He knows that real change never comes from outside, but always comes from within. And that is exactly the difference between power and authority, between imposing from outside, sometimes by coercion, and stimulating from within. 8. Compassion, a starting point. As a leader, you will always strive to put the interests of all other life, of all people, above your own interests, whatever it may mean to yourself. A very high ideal. And then laws of reincarnation and karma. 9. Recognizing the cyclicity in nature. The real leader knows the development takes place in upward cycles. We are always growing. This applies to both human life, reincarnation, and trends in society. It includes that you should try to learn from history and that you can also recognize that there are cyclical moments with opportunities for leadership that take the oneness of life more into account. Just look at the changes in political color in the past year in a number of countries, for instance in the UK. 10. Pursuing universal and sustainable solutions. The wise leader does not take measures that solve a problem in the short term, but only worsen that problem in the long term. Again, his policy is focused on the causes and not on treating the symptoms. Sustainable solutions mean, according to the so-called Brundtland definition of sustainability, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And we are thinking mainly of the well-being of man and nature. But there are many more important lines to be derived from this. Knowing that we, as humans, will reincarnate in groups again, we will always have to deal with each other. For our legal system, this means, among other things, the realization that punishment is pointless, but re-education is very useful, because the law of restoration of harmony, karma, helps people to learn life lessons that result from their actions in the past. And in any case, that punishments such as the death penalty are completely useless. No one benefits from them. And finally, with regard to the spiritual hierarchical structure, 11, recognizing the hierarchical structure of life. The leader is also a student himself and listens to those who are wiser than he is at a given moment. He does not have a monopoly on wisdom, knows that wisdom can grow, and is therefore open to greater visions and insights from the people around him. 12. Pursuing of brotherhood and cooperation. He will gather a group of trusted and reliable people around him because he always works in a team. He will constantly inspire his co-workers and they will inspire others. In short, we could say that the wise leader is an example of universality and inspiration, and therefore gets things done without coercion. This was the end of part 3. We will now have a 3 minutes break and see you after the break. Welcome back. Mariska, are there questions?
Yes, there are. Well, they look alike. So I start with the first question. You talked about that a wise leader had to be forced to lead. Does that mean that a wise man can't rule nowadays because too many people want a strong leader and not a wise leader?
Well, that is the question. Um, I can follow the idea that people want strong leaders in case there is, they do not like, let's say, the policy of the previous leader or the previous government. But whether that is always a that the profile they like is a strong leader, that can be open for discussion, I think. I would like to try to give a positive example where you can see that sometimes the people of a country do indeed want to have a leader that is not as much strong as well as it has the characteristic of a wise leader. And I will give you the present example of Bangladesh. Bangladesh has a history after it became in 1970 independent from Pakistan. It was in fact East Pakistan, and then they wanted to become an independent state because if you look at the map, then Pakistan, present Pakistan, is the west of India, and East Pakistan was east of India. So it was two separated countries geographically, and then you can expect that they want to govern themselves, and that is what happened. They had a lot of, let's say, inner fights between two main parties, and what happened last year was, or in the course of this year, I must say, that one of the ruling government introduced a certain law that really went back to the beginning of this independence of Bangladesh, and that gave a lot of tensions in the country. And then fights broke out. Over 200 people died in those tensions, and people start looking for someone who could lead the country that was not part of the two, let's say, opposing parties in the country. And then they asked a man in the country who was involved in politics already since the beginning of the independence of Bangladesh. His name is Muhammad Yunus, and he always strived for solutions that benefited the people at the basis of the country. So he proposed in the early 70s already a kind of independent rule of small villages so that the people in the villages could decide about the governance of their village themselves. And later on he started a bank called the Grameen Bank that was giving small loans, especially to women, to start their own business, microcredits they were called. So he was always looking at possibilities to for grassroots solutions that people could survive in a very harsh society. And in fact, his Grameen Bank and he himself got the Nobel Prize for Peace somewhere, I think, in the 90s, because it has helped millions of people to rise above poverty in Bangladesh. Now, when the tensions rose high this year in the country of Bangladesh, then these two warring parties decided that they should have someone who would be above parties, and they asked him, he's now 84 years old, to become temporarily the prime minister of a temporary government, to rule the country and to see how harmony can be restored again. And so far as I know, this works very well. And so this man was not selected or asked to be the prime minister of this country because he wanted to rule, because of his wisdom, and because he was asked and more or less pushed to take the lead. So there are really examples not to choose a strong leader, but to choose a wise leader. And I think there are more examples. The examples that I gave of José Mujica, he was in his younger years, he was part of the Tupamaros guerrilla troops. So he started his opposition to the ruling government in Uruguay as a guerrilla leader. But he also came to the conclusion, like also Nelson Mandela and other people, that this is not the way forward. So he changed his mindset completely, and he became one of the best leaders of Uruguay, trying to make the country more just, especially for the majority of the people. So the fact that people do choose or want strong leaders is because they sometimes are not capable enough of independent thinking, or don't want to think independently what is the best for the country, and to take their own responsibility in choosing wise leaders, and also do something in the governments of their village, of local communities, to contribute with their own wisdom to that. And so it is sometimes also a matter of, how do you call that? Um, um, uh, Being more passive when it is about ruling of the country, and not seeing or taking your own responsibility by having your own vision, building up your own ideal image of how the country should be ruled. And if you don't do that, then it is easy to say, let's get a strong leader who is going to arrange everything to our desires, and then this is it. No, take the trouble to think about social problems yourself, think about the solutions, contribute it, and then you get another mindset. And if you radiate that again to other people, then you get a more conscious type of people in the country, and you will be much more selective whom you elect during elections as people who govern the country. So yes, there are situations where people call for strong leaders, but that is not always the wise people who do that.
Okay,
So far.
thank you. The other question is more about humanity is still developing wisdom. So if people are voting, they don't. The people voting don't recognize always wisdom.
Mm.
So how can you? Are there enough leaders wise enough, and do people recognize them?
Yeah, yeah,
Will they
it
vote
is.
on them?
Yeah, yeah. That's in a nutshell. Is that a good definition of the problem? You have to have wise leaders, and you have to have wise voters, and they all should have something of wisdom in them. The voters should have wisdom in them to be able to recognize in the people they can vote for the wisdom, if they don't have it in themselves, they cannot recognize it in the wise leaders as well. So that here comes in the individual responsibility where I started the lecture with. So it is, you have to look at the, let's say, to look at society, that there is a need for human solidarity, to take responsibility for all of the state, feel yourself responsibility, and do this in a solidary way, and you should rely on your inner wisdom that can help you to make to see this wisdom and to recognize it in others. So if you train yourself in that, and if you radiate it also to your environment, then more people will be able to recognize wisdom in themselves and in other people. So it is an acceleration process. It all starts in yourself, but you can also stimulate and inspire other people to recognize in themselves and in the people who they have to elect, and what are the wisest people that they can choose from, and base their vote on what they think are the wisest people, according to their own insight in wisdom.
Thank you. Those were the questions, Joop.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. We will continue now with part 3. What is the point of voting? Well, we can be very short with that. The purpose of voting is that wise leaders will be in charge, of course. And helping tools for voting are the Theosophical basic principles, which again can be summarized as universal brotherhood, as a guideline for political discussions, which are always time-bound and culture-bound, of course. That in the first place. Second is recognizing the characteristics of wise leaders. I have tried to mention 12 characteristics of wise leaders, but you may come up in the next Sunday with maybe some other characteristics that are very valuable. So I'm looking forward to that. And of course, with these 12 characteristics that I have stated, we have set the bar very high. And I realize that hardly anyone will meet all these requirements, but it can help to choose who meets them the most. And third point, which I will deal with now, is when we make a conscientious choice, we can also appeal to the world conscience. And this was already mentioned already in the previous series of lectures by Barend Forham, and I will come back to that now. The world conscience is the accumulated knowledge of all mankind, so including the ethical and spiritual insights and experiences of highly developed beings, like for instance the Buddhas, to which we can appeal. International laws such as those of the United Nations, refugee treaties, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are currently the weak reflections of this ethical knowledge. It is the ethical reservoir of world conscience from which everyone can draw for determining their vote in elections. But of course, we leave it to everyone's own vision and ideals and responsibility to choose in their own way. Having the right to vote in a meaningful way is not self-evident in many countries, unfortunately. If you base your independently developed vision on oneness, justice, equality, human solidarity, and growth opportunities for everyone, then you come to the conclusion that the answer to the biblical question, am I my brother's keeper, is Yes. The consequence of this yes is that we must take responsibility in vision and behavior for the well-being of others, and that we all have a role in creating a better society. By being aware of the needs of others and taking action to support them, we can contribute to a more solidary world. Voting right is voting duty. You can interpret your right to vote as a duty to vote, and thereby letting your vision have a voice. Of course, choosing in the voting booth is only one more minimal part of a citizen's democratic duty, since democracy is only really enhanced when you yourself try to realize in your life the qualities that you expect the person you are voting for to possess. Indeed, if everyone takes responsibility, then collectively we create an atmosphere in which the wise leaders can actually step out of the background. And I just gave you during the question round the example of Muhammad Yunus in Bangladesh, that he in fact was asked by the people of Bangladesh to step out of the background and to become their leader upon their request. And also, again, think of Gandhi. Be the change you want to see in the world. Then you can help to get the leaders who are in line with that mindset. A good example of a contemporary ethical philosophy of life is that of the Ubuntu philosophy of Southern Africa. Ubuntu is about being one, being part of a greater whole, like the community of people and of nature. It is mainly about devotion and relationships between people. Many translations of Ubuntu are possible. The most famous one is, I am because we are. Another expression is, becoming human through others. Nelson Mandela said the following about Ubuntu. Ubuntu philosophy is a philosophy of life. Spiritual life force connects man with his society and nature. Reality is a dynamic of interacting forces. Striving to restore harmony and peace in a fragmented world is a crucial goal in this regard. Ubuntu is reconciliatory. How does Ubuntu take shape in governments? Governing multiple tribes is done from Ubuntu in a fundamentally different way than in the West. The Lekgotlah meeting, the gathering of the adults of a tribe, is a platform for dialogue, open communication, and decision-making for adults, and for problem solving, but more specifically, problem prevention. In Botswana, they have the saying, dialogue is the best way of waging war. The principles of the Lekgotlah are unity, openness, that is, utilizing the collective wisdom and talents, humility, and consensus, thereby creating support. How does the Lekgotlah work? Every adult has the right to attend the Lekgotlah meeting. Every voice counts. There is trust in the dialogue and respect for others. Truth is shared. Sometimes the way of communicating is by storytelling. And also listening is a very important aspect. there always follows a decision. How is the Lekgotlah composed? First, we have the chief, the tribal leader. He is in charge. Furthermore, there are the elders who contribute their wisdom and experience, and the tribal leaders who represent their part of the tribe. And of course, all other adult members, traditionally men, but nowadays also women take part in it. Then some more details about the chief, the tribal leader. In Botswana, they say, a chief is a chief by the people. He should govern with the consent of the people. Failure to function will result in deposition. This makes African tribes perhaps among the oldest democracies in the world. The required skills of the chief are as follows. He strives to get reality on the table. He asks good questions. He listens to everyone's voice, but stops endless discussions. He senses his environment well and has vision. He generates trust on the work floor through encouragement and motivation. He creates real involvement. He creates sufficient time for training and relaxation. He takes decisions, and he keeps the community together. The Lekgotlah process is a process with consultations that can take days to weeks to come to consensus. Everyone can share information of ideas without being looked at. The power of the Lekgotlah is the multitude of insights that come together. In addition to rational visions, also intuition is stimulated. Let me end this lecture today with a quotation from an ancient Bantu scripture on the Ubuntu philosophy called Sayings of the Ancient One. The Ancient One said, "He who walks the path of light is marked by compassion, for he understands the needs of the weary animal, the sorrows of the child, and the mind of the stranger. He is marked by harmony of the soul, for his eye perceives nature, his heart comprehends nature, and his courage enables him to dwell with nature. He is marked by skill in action, for he loves his work, he knows his work, and he works with will for no reward. He is marked by universal vision, for he loves all things. He is just to all beings, and he serves the law with gladness. O my son, when the marks of true manhood are engraved in the substance of your beings, you will ask no more for knowledge, nor will you crave to possess it, because you will be knowledge itself. May you follow the path of peace." This is the end of the lecture, and we will now have again 3 minutes break for your last questions. See you later. Welcome back. Mariska, are there any questions?
Just one, Joop. You talked about the Lekgotlah, the meeting with all the grown-ups. But and you said there was talking, speaking, listening. But what if some people during those meetings really get very emotional or upset or angry because it's not going the way they want? How do they handle then with the...
Well, first of all, of course, this can happen because it is, of course, a traditional philosophy, but also there people are growing beings, so these things can happen if the problems are very big, of course. But I think it is the task for the chief to try to calm down people who become too emotional, but it is also the Ubuntu philosophy is very much a let's say a community philosophy. The expression "I am because we are" indicates already that people are have a very strong sense of community, being a group. So their identity is also for a big part determined by the fact that they are living together and forming a group together, and they are interdependent from each other. So not only the chief in such a Gotla meeting will try to calm someone who gets very emotional, but also the people around him, the other elders, but also the other people who are in this meeting will try to help to calm down the emotions of people who become too emotional in this meeting, because they all are very, let's say, feel very responsible, feel very committed to take care of the needs of everybody in the community. Um, and yeah, because they feel this responsibility for the growth of every member of the community, they will probably start asking, why are you so upset? And they will try to understand what the background is why someone becomes so emotional. So it will be from a very yeah, comprehending way they will approach this behavior. That is what you could expect. I'm not saying that it will always happen like that, but that is the philosophy has that intention in itself. They all feel very responsible, and you may wonder, is this philosophy really practiced in certain part of Africa? I can tell you that it has played a very important role in, let's say, the regime change in the Republic of South Africa, because Nelson Mandela studied actually this philosophy while he was kept prison in Robben Island. And it was also this philosophical ideas that he had in mind when he became president, and together with amongst others Desmond Tutu, he issued the problem how to reconcile with the former enemies and to make the basis for a common future of all the groups in South African society, and how to deal uh, with the horrible past they had together. So reconciliation, and that is what I already told in the lecture when Nelson Mandela described the characteristics of the Ubuntu philosophy, that it is seeking for reconciliation uh, in order to create together a new future. And at the moment, I must say, in South Africa, this is going through a rather difficult phase, but there are other independent countries in the southern part of Africa, like, for instance, Botswana, where this has taken root much more deeply than in the Republic of South Africa, in my view, where also, for instance, the governments of commercial companies is also very much based on Ubuntu philosophy, so that the way decisions are taken in business companies is also very much more in line with this Gotla meeting types that I described in the lecture. That's why I gave a few examples, like the best way of waging war is by dialogue, because that is really also practiced in a country like Botswana, although they are also facing problems there because in the soil of Botswana there is a lot of diamond sources, and that is also you know giving desires in the people to become rich in a very quick way. So everybody has its own how do you say that, challenges. Every society has its own challenges, but nevertheless you should realize that this Ubuntu philosophy is more than 2,500 years old, and it is before the colonial powers colonized big parts of the African continent. There were kingdoms and states in African society that had this very strong Ubuntu philosophy as their philosophy of life, and it held these people very much together in a very, let's say, social way. So it has flourished during centuries before the colonial powers took power in Africa. So it has a very strong history and is rooted in several countries in the southern part of Africa. And sometimes it flourishes and sometimes it is also under tension and it is under pressure. But nevertheless, it is very interesting to see how strongly it has influenced the course of history in the southern part of Africa and is still making countries like Botswana to flourish in a much better way than other countries in for instance, Africa or Southern America or other parts of the world. And in, I think it was 2004, 2005, Botswana was very high ranking as a country where many things were really at ease, like the percentage of people living under the line of poverty was quickly decreasing, less criminality and so on. So when this philosophy can become a fundamental part of the governance of state and of everything, then that is a very good thing because it really stabilizes the country, decreases poverty, gives a big impulse to the development of every human being in these countries. And that is why it is such an interesting example, because it is actually wisdom in practice, wisdom in action. And that's why I mentioned it.
Well, thank you, Joop. That was the last question for tonight.
Okay. Thank you for your interesting question. It always helps to give some more background on the subject, and also you can bring in your own experience, your own views. I would like to mention that next week, Sunday, we will have a study on the lecture of today. And in the course of the week, there will also be a reader with a text written by Madame Blavatsky, which was part of the book The Key to Theosophy. And it is about ideas on politics. So I hope you will read it and find it interesting. And hope we will be able to exchange some ideas next week, Sunday, on the subject. And I'm looking forward to that. So, and then in January we will have another lecture, which gives quite an explanation or an exploration on different types of governance if we talk about democracy. We will now close the lecture of today with the Gayatri from the Rig Veda, and it runs as follows. O thou golden sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds so that we, recognizing our oneness with the divinity, which is the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and tread it to those distant goals of perfection, stimulated by thine own radiant light.